Welcome to Campus Talk. Today, we are speaking with architect Arul Paul, Associate Professor at NITE Institute of Architecture, whose research explores architectural history through critical and queer perspective. He is the co-author of A Queer Reading of Nawabi Architecture and the Colonial Archive, Lucknow Queerscapes, a book that re-examines Lucknow's Nawabi architecture and colonial archives to uncover hidden narratives of identity, power, and space. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Bhumi. It's nice to be here.
Sir, so you began your career as an architect and now work with architectural history and queer studies. Could you walk us through how your interest in architecture first began and what led you to explore these particular areas of research?
Sure. Like most people, I knew that I wanted to do something creative, be in a creative profession, but I wasn't sure what exactly that would be. So, entrance examinations, trying to figure out what my forte is. I was very lucky to have a mentor at a very young age who could who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, which is potential at that point of time. And then, to be able to, somebody who understood me and then, gave me the right direction to move to architecture. In terms of architectural history, that's a different story. It's to be very honest, when I was in school or in college, history wasn't necessarily my favorite subject. I think it was also very much about the way history is taught. And so when I started teaching architecture, which was about 15 years ago, students would make presentations of, buildings from across the world, various places and times. And I realized that I had a kind of worldview that where I could, spot these small inconsistencies, little anachronisms, and sort of ask questions and, sort of try to understand that, the narrative of what history is something that is a constructed narrative. And that's where, I sort of fell in love with history, I think you could say. In terms of queer studies, now, queer studies is something that is very personal to me. It also comes from identity. But when I was at CEPT in Ahmedabad for my master's, which was in history, theory, and criticism, that is when I met a cohort of students. We were a small group. And that's where I heard queer voices in academia. CEPT provided us, that kind of space. And a lot of questions started developing from that space. And those are questions I'm still trying to grapple with and answer even today.
That's interesting to listen about, sir. Sir, for some people, the term queer architecture can feel abstract. How would you define it in your work, and how might this perspective influence conservation or restoration practices in real projects?
It's a very good question. I'm not surprised that people find the idea of queer architecture abstract, because the profession itself, architects, many believe that architecture is neutral. They don't believe that identity or gender play any role in architecture. That architecture is just a container, and that people inhabit or move through. I'm definitely not of that opinion, and my research works very much on how architecture shapes us as individuals, it shapes how we live, how we move, how we interact with each other. And we shape it, we design, we construct, and we also inhabit architecture. So I think that it is very much a back and forth process between between people, between bodies, between space, and between identity. So, in my research, I'm not necessarily trying to define architecture, especially queer architecture, because queer is not a word that is easy to define. It's not a word that allows for a simple definition. Look at the work of someone like Sarah Emmel and others. Queer is not something that is a fixed or stable identity. It's very fluid, and in that lies its strength, in the fact that it brings all these multiple perspectives together. So I think that as architects and as designers, it's very important for us to create spaces that are inclusive. And in order to create spaces that are inclusive, we need to look at how various communities shape space and inhabit space. And the queer community as well.
Mm.
So I think this is something that is at the basis of much of my work.
Your book, A Queer Reading of Nawabi Architecture and the Colonial Archive, deals with complex and layered ideas. How would you describe its essence in simple terms for someone outside architecture, and what is the key message you'd want architects themselves to hear?
So the book is situated very much in the city of Lucknow.
Mm.
And what really is exciting about Lucknow is the fact that the Nawabs of Lucknow were patrons of art. They were also performers. Wajid Ali Shah, for example, was a dancer and has really shaped the way, has shaped Kathak as a practice. Asifudullah, for example, was a poet, and when he wrote very much about his own inner world and his desires. So I think what we see in Lucknow is agency, where the Nawabs are not on the outside looking in. They're very much situated at the very heart of cultural production in Lucknow. This compared to what we see in Western queer discourse, where queer space is often claimed or appropriated. In Lucknow, what we see are these spaces that are actually crafted and created. So that to me is what really drew the project towards Lucknow. So, having said that, that is not to say that the architecture of Lucknow was not subversive. I think it definitely was, especially in terms of the colonial gaze, right? When the British came to Lucknow and tried to understand, they found themselves feeling very disoriented, and I think the architecture played an important role in that. So, what happens here is that when the British, prioritize things like, restraint and masculinity and austerity. We see an architecture in Lucknow that is, very exuberant and very sensuous. And so this leads to another question that the book deals with, which is, why is Lucknow absent from, the current architectural canon of architectural history? So, we sort of try to unpack the layers behind this idea, and this definitely comes from the same space where these are colonial ideas that get passed down through generations, and this colonial discomfort with the architecture of Lucknow persists even today. In the fact that the architecture of Lucknow is missing from the modern architectural discourse.
Sir, you have been teaching at NITE Institute of Architecture for some time now. In what ways has the experience of teaching there shaped or refined your ideas? And what do you find distinctive about NIA's approach to architecture education?
So I think what is most distinctive about NITE Institute of Architecture is the fact that we are not necessarily imagining curriculum and pedagogy, for example, to be something that is stable or something that is fixed. It's constantly in flux, and this is not change for the sake of change. It's basically a reflection of how fast the world is changing around us, right? In terms of society, in terms of technology, in terms of environment. So all that needs to get reflected in the way that we teach, the way that we learn. And this flexibility is also very true of the students, because the students also have the opportunity here at NIA to be able to choose their own path through the course. So whether it is through electives or studio based options that are given to them, through value added courses, through internships and practical learning, students find their own path through the course. So what you'll notice at NIA is that no two students have an identical academic journey, which I think is something that is very special about the way we do things at the school. And another thing that I really appreciate is the fact that we as faculty can bring our own research into the classroom. For example, we recently had a studio on intersectionality, where we looked at the intersection, say, of of class, of gender, of age, of ability, how all of these intersect, right? How all these identities intersect and how they affect and have a dialogue with spatial practices. So I think it's when I think of what we do here at NIA, I think it's almost an interweaving of very strong ethics in terms of social and environmental ethics, along with ideas of research and practice, coming
Yeah.
together.
So, sir, could you tell us what you're currently working on, especially in terms of research or ongoing projects?
So the research that I'm currently working on is tentatively titled Queer Spatial Imaginaries. So this is looking again at architecture and urbanism through a queer perspective. But what is interesting here is that I'm also looking at it through the medium of media. So I'm looking at television, I'm looking at films, I'm looking at visual culture, and trying to understand how space is represented, how it is created on screen, and the idea of screen space not just being a representation of space but being a spatial practice in itself is something that is an idea that I'm working with, and I want to work very specifically on examples of media from South Asia and to contextualize it here. So it's very much like the book project, but instead of looking at historical material, I'm looking at contemporary media.
Architecture is constantly evolving. From your vantage point as a teacher and researcher, what do you think the future of architecture should look like, and what changes would you like to see in the field?
Yes. So architecture and urbanism to me is very much a reflection of society. It shows us how diverse societies can be, and it also shows me, what societies value the most. So, what is the most important, or who is the most important? And this is where I feel that if we design without keeping in mind a spectrum of people, without, for example, considering all classes or all bodies or all ways of living, then what we end up doing is we end up reverting to a default which is a very normative default, which would mean that the most vulnerable or the most marginalized people in society are going to be the ones that are left out. So I'm not coming from a place of idealism. This to me is very much about design ethics. And, what we've seen through our experience is that, when we design spaces that, accommodate all people, that accommodate the most vulnerable and marginalized people, spaces where, spaces where they don't have to fear, where they feel comfortable, where they feel that they have a sense of dignity. These spaces that are very accessible, are spaces that also tend to be the most exuberant and full of life. So I think in this case it's definitely a win-win, where as architects and urban designers we really need to I don't think that a lot of us think that architecture can change the world, but if not changing the world, even the smallest things that we do to move in this direction, to take society in onto a path that is more humane and more equitable for all, I think is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Arul sir, for sharing your insights and experience with us. Your work opens up new ways of looking at architecture and history and gives both practitioners and students a lot to think about. We look forward to seeing how your future projects continue to shape architectural discourse. Thank you for joining us in Campus Talk.